Welcome to Losing a Child, Always Andy's Mom. On this podcast, we journey through the devastating experience of the death of a child. Grief is seldom discussed openly in our culture, and the death of a child makes people feel even more uncomfortable. We approach the topic openly and honestly, speaking to people who have lost loved ones and experts who help care for them. Whether you are a parent experiencing loss or someone who wants to support another going through this tragedy, this podcast strives to offer hope and help.
Thank you so much, Laura, for agreeing to come on the Always Andy's Mom podcast. I'm excited to talk to you about Luke.
Thank you, Marcy. I'm excited to talk about him and be part of this podcast.
Yeah.
And I just want to say I really appreciate your podcast and your kind of ministry here to other moms who've lost children.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Well, why don't you just go ahead and start and just tell us all about Luke?
Luke, I'm the mother of 3 boys. Also the wife of almost 30 years now of my husband, James.
Wow.
Yeah. My oldest 2 boys happen to be on the autism spectrum. Right now they're 26 and 24, Sam and Jay. And then my youngest son is Luke. He would be turning 21 on August 15th. But he was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer right as he was turning 15. Wow. That, the quick story is that within a few weeks, it was diagnosed as stage 4, something called rhabdomyosarcoma, and he had to have his right leg amputated above the knee. And this was all right as he was supposed to be starting his freshman year of high school, which he was very excited to be.
Yeah.
He was.
Well, why don't you just back up a little bit and just tell us about Luke and just talk about who he was as a kid and just so we can get to know him a little bit.
Sure. So he was, I used to call him my sunshine. I would sing "You Are My Sunshine" to him. Sometimes I'd sing it to the other boys too, to wake them up in the morning. But when I would sing it to him, I would realize how that song fit him. He was just so bright. He was such an extrovert, so friendly. Even from a baby, he was just this laid back, happy-go-lucky baby, and loved being around people. So as much as really, I think everybody else in our family is more introverted, and he was this extreme extrovert.
Okay.
Loved to be around people. If he would see someone that a total stranger, but they were alone, he would go over and talk to them because he thought, well, they need somebody to talk to, because he always likes having someone around. So he was a very bright, intelligent. From early on, we could see that he was doing, he was going into kindergarten, learning how to do multiplication and division just because his older brothers were, and he wanted to figure it out, and he could.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's impressive.
Yeah. He also around that age, he liked to play Connect Four, but he liked to challenge adults because he liked to beat them. So we had a lot of mostly college students coming in and out of our house because of the ministry my husband was in. And he would say, "Oh, do you want to play Connect Four?" He's this little 5-year-old. And they'd say, "Sure." And you'd see him play the first game real, like they're going to be real generous with him. And you'd see their, they'd think, "Oh, wait, he knows what he's doing." So then the next game they were going to really try. And after they lost the 3rd game to him, they'd look up at me and say, "I'm really trying." I know, I really try to. I lose a lot to it. Had a way with, he was smart and bright and, bubbly. As he grew up, he would have these hobbies or interests that he would just dive into full force and wanted perfect it. So at some point he saw a yo-yo expert come into his school for an assembly. He was into yo-yos for a while, learning some yo-yo tricks. tall buildings were something he was really excited about, like the world's tallest buildings. So that was more just learning the facts about tall buildings. And but one of his biggest was, he did a little skateboarding, a little rollerblading, but one of his biggest ones was magic. And he was in middle school, about 12 years old, and taught himself magic through videos on the internet. And he was amazing, mind blowing.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
You know, he'd of course do it with adults and one of the things was he had that personality to like, he just so comfortably talked and pulled people in and made jokes. And so, you know, he'd be doing this magic trick and be like, well, look in your back pocket. And they'd pull out the card. And even I would think, when did he put that in the back pocket? How did it get there? One time even we were delayed in an airport on a family vacation, and he was watching how angry the customers, you know, were getting, because our flight was a mechanical problem, and we were just delayed, and eventually our flight got canceled. And so he went over to the person working at the gate and said, "Can I do some magic for you?" Because he wanted to relieve their tension because so many people were so and then the gate agent is calling out the flight attendants and the pilots, "Come watch this kid, he's doing a magic show for me." And again, that's who he was, you know.
Right.
Yeah, he wanted to make people happy. He loved interacting with people. He wasn't afraid of anybody. And I mentioned the adults, he would interact with adults pretty comfortably, but he loved kids too, younger kids, and playing with them too. And so, yeah, he was also musically talented. He was a very good pianist. He played the flute in the band, but he did choose the flute because it would be the smallest instrument that he could carry back and forth to school. And he could even just stash it in his locker.
Yeah. I was a flute player. That's very smart. My Andy chose the French horn. That's not great. And he's the absolute smallest kid in his class. And there he would be lugging this huge French horn back and forth to school constantly. It was hilarious, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. But he would pick up other instruments and just teach himself. Like, we had a saxophone in our house, so he taught himself the alto sax and signed up to be in the jazz band for a year.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, he was excited going into his freshman year that summer. He was excited about being in marching band. At that time, his hope was to get a music education degree and maybe be a high school band director himself one day. He had been practicing tennis over the summer, and he was excited to be on the tennis team. Again, I had mentioned earlier that didn't happen. The tennis team didn't happen because of the cancer. So, yeah.
So how did things start? What happened for the diagnosis of the cancer? When did you first notice something was wrong, I should say?
It was May of 2015. It was diagnosed in August of 2015. He had been playing Frisbee, and it was a new interest that summer, Frisbee.
And, of course.
Yeah. He was just playing out in the street with someone, and he thought, because he came down, kind of came down on a curb and kind of extended his Achilles tendon. And that's where he felt it, the pain. He thought, and we thought he injured
from the injury. Yeah.
Yeah. And took him in. I said, well, let's give it a couple of weeks, because if it's a sprain, it'll, heal in a couple of weeks. And when it hadn't, we went in to see our family doctor, happened to see a PA at the office, and she thought it was, again, just an injury and he needed to stay off it, which he wasn't doing. I kept saying, you need to stop playing mitt Frisbee. You need to stop practicing tennis so much. But he kept doing these things. But it was interesting because sometimes it would be painful and you wouldn't really know why. And other times it wouldn't be painful, but he had just played ultimate frisbee and, practiced tennis. So we went back 2 more times that summer. One was just for his physical, and happened to see that same PA each time. And she said, well, maybe you want to go see a sports medicine doctor. Maybe they can, help figure out how to heal this. And we went there the end of July, the local sports medicine doctor, and he took an x-ray, which really doesn't show you a lot unless there's a break, I believe. And he said, well, let's do an MRI. And he said, I think he has some kind of Achilles injury, maybe even a tear, and the MRI would tell us that. And so he had gone to band camp, and when he came back that night, we went to do the MRI. And then 2 or 3 days later, he left to go to Young Life camp. And they called and said, we need to do another MRI with contrast. And what I didn't know was the contrast was to look for a tumor. So they had seen something suspicious, but they didn't tell us that. They just said, we need to do another one. So when he came back, they did another one that day or the next day after he came back from camp. And then they called us the next morning. And it's one of those, I'll never forget this phone call.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, they called my husband's cell phone early in the morning, and he usually doesn't turn it on until he's about ready to go to work. So he was about to go to work, I'm guessing around 9 a.m. And he said, oh, hey, the doctor's office has called twice now. I'm going to call them on my way into work, and I'll call you and let you know what they said. But he never left the house. He came back in on the phone and said, they're going to get him out of a meeting right now, Laura. So I think maybe we should take this call, together. Together. And even then, all I thought was, oh, he's going to have surgery. Yeah. And like, oh, that'll be too bad. But,
Yeah. And you think, oh, he's not going to probably be able to do marching band this fall.
Yeah. Or tennis. Yeah. And that'll be hard. It never occurred to me that there was a tumor growing in there. Right. And it was, I didn't say this, it was swelling more and more as the summer progressed. There was swelling there. And so, then the doctor said, we saw a very large tumor in your son's calf, about 7-8 inches long. And we think the radiologist and I think it's probably cancer, but you won't know for sure until you get a biopsy done. And he referred us to, Helen DeVos Children's Hospital. The orthopedic surgeon was just part of Spectrum, not really a pediatric, but so that was on a Friday. It happened to be the day before his birthday, his 15th birthday. And on Monday we went and did a biopsy. And on the following Friday, which would have been the 21st, we got the call. Yes, it is cancer. And it's called rhabdomyosarcoma, which I had never heard of, but which happens to be a pediatric cancer, which again, I didn't realize there are cancers that are exclusive to children.
Pediatrics. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and
that's one I'm definitely familiar with, but that's because I'm a pediatrician. So yeah.
And then the next week was scans and tests to see how far along it was. And that week we found out it was stage 4. It had there were a couple spots in his lungs, in his pelvic area. There were a couple spots. And then that's when they started talking about amputation, that this tumor was so large and had taken over so much of his muscle and his nerves that the only thing they could do was amputate. And they laid out this year-long plan of treatment at this children's hospital in Grand Rapids. And they said, now we can do the surgery first thing, or we can start with chemo and treatment. And in about 3 months, we take a little break from chemo and do the surgery. And at 15, we gave Luke the option, and he said, I'd rather just get it over with and do it right away. And so that meant in less than a week, once we said yes, he was going to have his leg amputated. And it was all just, it was like surreal and a nightmare. And how is this our lives? My totally healthy kid is now going to have his leg amputated and spend a year getting chemotherapy. And he's not going to be marching with the band this fall, and he's not going to play tennis. It's just such a shock when you hear cancer, I'm sure, for anyone in any stage of life. But yeah.
And Luke too was the one that probably was the one you didn't worry about as much. Right?
Yeah.
Right.
As I'm a Christian, I'm a believer, have a pretty deep faith. And I struggled with my older two being diagnosed on the autism spectrum. I struggled with asking God, why would you let this happen? Why would you let a second son be diagnosed in my family? And so there was definitely a part of me saying, okay, really? I already have 2 children with lifelong disabilities. And now my third one's going to face cancer. Why wouldn't you step in, Lord? Why wouldn't you heal this so we didn't have to deal with this? So it was something I've wrestled with and still now and then wrestle with God.
Of course.
Yeah. But I will say Luke, he was a believer by then, and his faith was really amazing. At some point early on, my husband had looked up some statistics, and he said, Luke, 1 in 400 children are going to be diagnosed with this in the United States this year. You're just 1 in 400, And Luke said, well, I'm glad it's me and not somebody who doesn't know Christ, because I think it's going to be easier for me. His parents were thinking, we're not glad.
No, not at all.
Yeah. We wish we could have that attitude, but we don't. We're still saying, God, come on. And I said to him sometime in that process of being diagnosed with stage 4 and knowing he was going to get an amputation, and I said, Luke, you don't deserve this. This is so unfair. And he said, Mom, I don't deserve any. I deserve the death that Jesus died on the cross. Again, my mom heart, didn't really want to hear that, but I appreciated that he had that perspective.
Yeah.
It's actually just recently become more of mine. It's taken almost 4 years to start looking at life that way and what happens to us in life, and not saying, God, this is unfair, but realizing all that he's given us and done for us.
Well, and I just think about, sometimes the why me, but then you kind of do the, well, why not me? Right? I mean, why not me?
Right. Right. Like I said, I'm a believer, but I'm no better than anybody else. I sin just as much as anybody else. I need Christ's, death on the cross just as much as anyone else. But for whatever reason in our human heads, we like to say, wait, no, I don't deserve this.
No, I know. Come on, really? Yeah.
Right.
So what was his course then like? So he had the surgery, and then you started, I'm sure, some chemotherapy.
Well, it was very rough in the beginning. The surgery went fine. But of course, the adjustment to not having a limb is difficult. Phantom pain is very real. And that was very hard for Luke to feel like that leg was there when it wasn't. He didn't want to look at his stump. That was very difficult for him. And he didn't for maybe a few months before, for some reason, he really had to. But he was having a little trouble healing from the surgery. The incision was looking irritated and red. And so we were bumping back, starting chemo.
Right.
And then they did a second very minor surgery to see if there was an infection. And it turned out there wasn't. They think he just had a reaction to the type of sutures they were using. So they switched to a different type. And then the redness really went away very quickly. But before we started chemo, within probably 2 weeks of that second surgery, he was having a lot of pain in his stomach and his abdomen, and it was getting worse and worse. And then I would call and talk to the doctor and say, I mean, he's in a lot of pain, kind of holding himself, and they would say, well, if he starts throwing up, then bring him in, and it's probably the antibiotic that has. So he did start throwing up. We came in. It took a couple days and another scan before what they realized was happening was that he had a blockage in his intestines. Oh, and they did, an emergency surgery. It was like 11:30 at night. And as it turned out, he had 2 tumors in his intestines that were blocking, and they took out somewhere around a foot or a foot each of intestines, small intestines. But everything else looked good, that they didn't see any other tumors growing in there. And they said, we can give him 1 week to heal from the surgery, but then we've got to start chemotherapy.
Right.
So he was still healing from this major abdominal surgery, and we started chemotherapy. The doctors told us this cancer does respond usually very quickly to chemotherapy. And that was true that was in October. And by Christmas time, we had a scan in the new year, I guess. And there was lots of shrinkage and disappearing of some of the tumors, not all of them, but the chemo really did work very effectively right away. But they warned us that they were more concerned about it relapsing than they knew they'd see this response right away, but relapse was the big issue with this particular cancer.
Yeah. You get it down, but you just couldn't quite get rid of everything. So then it would,
Right. We never did he never was totally cancer-free. When he was almost there, about a year later, a little less than a year later, this tumor that had disappeared after that first set of scans in his sacrum appeared again. And at that point, that's called a relapse, even though we never were in,
total remission. Yeah.
Remission. And that means you have to try new chemos because the cancer has become resistant to the chemotherapies you're using. And so we switched to some different chemos. And that one of the problems, which this happens with cancer and treatments, you just always have unexpected, was he was allergic to one of those chemos, but it wasn't, it took a few months for them to realize he developed this cough that wasn't going away. And it was inflammation in his lungs from an allergic reaction to one of the chemos. So then we had to switch to a new chemo, drug. He had radiation 2 different times, once the first spring and then once that fall. The one that fall was on his sacrum, on that tumor that was so stubborn. So that was fall of 2016. By February of 2017, we had a set of scans, and that showed that the sacrum tumor, even though it was radiated for 28 days and still doing chemo, was still there, and that a couple other tumors were now popping back up again. And at that point, the doctors told us that this would take his life. And they told Luke, at his age, we always had him know what was going on exactly. Right. And had him part of the decision process. And he had really struggled with the treatment didn't have an end, basically, because it kept getting delayed. And then we changed what kind of, chemo. And when we changed the kind of chemo, they didn't lay out a plan that said in this many weeks we'll be done. They said, we don't, and we'll be done. And that he did not like that at all. That really gave him a lot of anxiety. And he said, I don't know if he said this to me, but he had written it in a journal that he almost wished he would find out he was going to die, because then there would be an ending, because he didn't like this no ending to it. And so in February of 2017, that's what the doctor told him. He was almost happy when he heard at the moment. And it did, hit him later, the grief of his life was going to end. I thought he would say, I'm just done with treatment. He hated the chemotherapies and the side effects, the nausea, the diarrhea, the feeling weak and dizzy all the time, all the while trying to do physical therapy to learn to use this prosthetic leg. But he really wanted to work at a Young Life camp. He grew up going to Young Life camps when his father was working there, because that was my husband's job. And there's a volunteer crew there called the Work Crew each month that are high school students that volunteer, and they wait tables or do cleaning or do outdoor work. And that was his bucket list, was I want to be on the Work Crew before I die. And so he said, I want to try a clinical trial, something that might, at least not mean inpatient stays for him. He hated to be inpatient. And it gave him the time he needed to be able to work on the Work Crew that summer in July and August, which is, the camp is in Michigan. But he was under hospice care by then. And the hospice nurse just said, oh, that's great. I get to drive up to this camp. And
well, good. Glad they had that outlook.
Yeah. So that the nurse would come up about once a week while he was there. He was getting sicker, weaker, having just more issues while we were there. As a matter of fact, after the first week, he had just felt sicker and sicker and was doing less and less work with his crew. And we were all felt very defeated, because he said, I think I better just go home, because this isn't working. And again, in my faith, I was just so angry. I went out on the property where I knew no one would be and just yelled at God. And I said, look, I'm accepting that he is going to die. All he wanted was to be on this work crew. You can't give that to us. And it wasn't even an asking for a change. I just was letting that anger out. And that evening, he had fallen asleep early in the evening, which was a little unusual for him. And he woke up. I think I was going to give him some meds for pain. And he heard people in the lobby of the building we were staying in. And he said, well, what's going on? And I said, well, they have that little party when camp changes over and we don't have any campers. And so they're playing some games and some cards. And he said, well, can I go out? And I said, if you're feeling up to it, yeah, you can go out. So he gets in his wheelchair and we take him out, and he joins a game and is having a great time and stays up till like 1:00 playing cards with some people. And the next morning when he wakes up, he was just so much better. He just felt so much better. And, maybe God said, I'll gift you another week,
Yeah. Yeah.
And he was able to he wasn't able to serve on the work crew like he would have if he was healthy. He would sleep in. He would try to eat lunch with his work crew, do some work in the afternoon. He even, which was big for him, would say, I'm going to go back and rest for a while before dinner. And then he'd have dinner and do whatever else the work crew was doing that evening. And he did that for another week, but he was getting more and more tired. But he got to do some of the big things that he wanted to do on the work crew, one of which was share his testimony with a group of campers.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing he got to do at the end was they have all the work crew on the stage in front of all the campers, and they hold up signs that are kind of a really brief testimony, like struggled with eating disorder, and now I'm healed by Jesus, or had a bad relationship with my father growing up, but now I have a father in heaven on the other side. So they had Luke come out last. He had his prosthetic on, which what we didn't know then would be the last time he ever wore his prosthetic. Mm-hmm. And he kind of limped out. It wasn't fitting quite right. And his sign said, broken on earth. And then he turned it around and it said, made whole in heaven. And I don't know how much the campers knew about his story, that we knew within weeks he would probably pass away, but this was his last wish. Yeah. But it was so powerful to all of us who did know his story, because that was his perspective. He did one little writing on the blog, and that summer where he said, my situation is not ideal, but if it doesn't, if I'm not healed, I know I'll go to heaven, and that will be ideal. Yeah. So he had this eternal perspective. And again, just the work crew was like this chance to just make new friends and get to know new people. And even in his, feeling weaker and sicker, that was still what he wanted.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it is comforting to know. I mean, I think about my own son, Andy, and, he was in the car one time, and I've shared this before, that he was doing a carpool they sang in the Grand Rapids Choir of Men and Boys, and they were just going to rehearsal. And somehow the subject of heaven came up, and one of the other boys in the car was, terrified of death. And Andy was like, why are you scared to die? I'm not scared to die. Heaven is going to be awesome. And he just went on and on about how amazing heaven was going to be, because he and his Bible study had been studying Revelation, and he was very much focused on that, and obviously I've told the story of him when he was 7, telling me he wasn't going to grow up all the way and that he was going to be in heaven. And he just was always completely fine with it. And that is comforting. It gives me comfort. And I know must have given you very similar comfort to see him holding a sign saying made whole in heaven. Like he was like, I'm okay. I'm going to be fine in heaven. And Andy was the same way. I mean, I'm not fine here at all without him, but I know he's fine.
Yeah.
Better than fine, actually.
Yeah. And that's part of the grief. Sometimes somebody who'd be with me and I'd be crying and grieving would say, oh, Luke's okay now. And one time I said, I know Luke's okay now. I'm not okay.
Right. Exactly.
The grief is about my separation from my son here on the earth, which even though I believe there's a heaven, it just still feels so final.
It's so funny. I've said this before. Unfortunately, I wish it would help me today. I wish that knowledge would help me in my moment to moment grief, but in so many ways it doesn't. And that's hard. And it's hard for, I think, other Christians to understand that if they haven't experienced it. Because you're like, I don't understand why you're so sad. Your son's in heaven. I totally know that. And don't get me wrong. I know that. And people that say, well, this is all part of God's plan. I know that. But for me in this moment, I hate God's plan. Right. I do with like every bit of me. I hate it. That doesn't mean it's not right and good and the right thing. I know that. So please don't just preach that to me, because it just, now I feel like I'm a bad Christian too. That's the last thing I need, is feel like, oh, you're a grieving mom and a really bad Christian. Please don't do that to me. Because I know these things. I know these things. It's just when your heart just still just aches.
Yeah. You just
Yeah.
you want your children nearby. I mean,
Yeah.
my children haven't moved far away, but even that is hard for moms. You know,
Right?
your children grow up and might move across the country, but imagine, you can't talk to them. You can't see
Can't
them,
hug them. You can't give
can't
that
hug
hug.
them. And there's just a part of me that dies,
Right. I mean, there are
because
still days that I just long to hug him so much, and it just hurts so badly that I can't.
yeah,
It's I feel like I think those moments probably aren't quite as common as they were obviously at the beginning, but I still have them.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
And that's, it's coming up on 4 years, and I see a difference in my grief,
Yeah.
that it's just maybe not as often,
Yeah.
I'm able to engage more with the world fully. But the waves still come, and it still feels just as intense that he's not here with me.
Mhm.
And how is this our life? How did this happen to
Yeah.
us? And I
Yeah.
don't mean it like, I don't know. It's the worst thing you can imagine. So you think it won't ever happen to you. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
because I'm any more deserving or non-deserving of it if it's anybody else, but
No, for sure not.
yeah.
For sure not. But it's still this disbelief. I've been having that feeling a lot lately. I don't really know why, but there's
Yeah.
this, like, I'm just walking down the hallway or something and go, this is my life now. How is this my life? How did I
Right.
get here? Like,
Yeah.
how did I get here? It just doesn't feel right. I still feel like in some ways I'm living someone else's life.
Yes.
Like,
Yeah.
I, I
Yeah.
think back 3 years ago, obviously 3 years ago was just before Andy died. I couldn't even imagine in a second that this is where I would be now. That I'd be like doing a podcast and like talking to grieving parents all the time. And I'm just, I, I can't believe this is what my life is.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's the same for me. Like
Yeah.
how did, yeah, I don't
So
know.
I'm going to remind my listeners because I did not mention this at the beginning, but Laura is one of the people that wrote in on my episode with Gwen, that follow up on, kind of finding meaning making and purpose in your grief. So, and I said at that time that she was going to be on in a few weeks. And so here she is. So, why don't you just talk a little bit about that and about your life kind of now and what maybe made you write that and what you're thinking about?
Yeah. So I was a psychology major in college
Mhm.
because I liked psychology. Didn't know what I
I was
wanted to
too,
do
by the
with
way.
it. Yeah.
I was a
And
psychology major and a biology major, and I always said that the biology major was my practical major and the psychology major was my fun major because I
yes,
just loved
yes,
psychology. Mhm.
yes. And that was actually when I had my first experience of some deep grief in college. My older brother died when I was in college. And I
Mhm.
remember not long after he died, we were studying the stages of grief in one of my classes, probably fairly briefly, but I remember identifying with those stages.
Mhm.
And so it was an interest of mine, this grief. Um, I had also lost my mom to cancer. It's been 7.5 years ago now.
Mhm.
And again, the grieving process, that was even more difficult than losing my brother, and identifying, this grieving process. I just, because I like psychology, I don't do this to other people, but I psychoanalyze myself. Why am I thinking this
Uh-huh.
way? Why am I feeling this way? How does this fit in? Um, and I remember that. And then as a Christian too, how, just coming to God with all these emotions. And
Mhm.
I remember the anger when my mom passed away with God surprised me.
Mhm.
And the anger also after Luke passed away surprised me even more because it was
Yeah.
even more intense. It lasted longer. I was so
Yep.
angry with God, and I think it's just my opinion, but there is naturally anger and grief. If you don't have a relationship with God, you're probably not angry with God. But
Sure.
yeah, but for me, that's where I laid the blame. It wasn't even somebody's fault that he got cancer.
Right.
It's
Right.
living in this world. So I've wanted to, because it was already somewhat of an interest. I had also gone to school. I'd gone back to school to get a master's of social work. But
Mhm.
when my mom got sick, I had stepped away from it thinking I would step back into it eventually, but I never did so far.
Yeah.
Luke got sick about 1.5 years after my mom died. And so, and I kind of, as I've been an adult, I realized caring profession, caring ministry is kind of what the way God made me, which
Uh-huh.
is a lot of just listening.
I know. It's funny because I had that same realization after Andy died. I was trying to kind of define myself, and I was realizing I'm just a caregiver. That's what I
Yeah.
do. That's like how I define myself,
Yeah.
is really as a caregiver. So how can I
Right.
do that? How can I do
Right.
that in my grief? Mm-hmm.
I would say with nurses, I'd think if I could handle blood and needles, I'd like to be a nurse because you're so practically caring for people. But I have a problem with not passing out in those situations. So,
Not a good career choice for you. Yeah. Uh-huh.
but something along the lines of social work, psychology, listening, ministries, that in these last few years I've really wanted to use what God's teaching me, what I've learned about grief, to just walk with people through their grief.
Yeah.
Because that's all we can do. Nobody's gonna, early on when people would, maybe even verbalize, I wish there was some way I could help you, I would think, and maybe even say out loud once in a while, unless you can bring Luke back, there's really nothing you can do to help relieve this pain.
Mm-hmm.
But having people there with me, knowing that they would stay by me even while I was in the pain, meant so much to me. I didn't feel so alone.
Yeah.
And then even meeting other parents, moms who have lost children when they were young, helped me know I wasn't alone. And it feels like that's about the best we can do.
Yeah.
Which is a lot. I don't want to make it sound like it's not a lot. It really is a lot to have those people in your life, even if it's just listening to a podcast and knowing, oh, how I feel. There's not something wrong with me. It's not unique to my situation.
Mm-hmm. It is so nice to not feel as alone and it just not feel as isolated. I know I feel that way. Yeah. Really, just to be able to have those relationships and talks with people is really helpful. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's helpful for me too sometimes, even though I might be there for the other person to, my purpose is to walk with them, but I feel less alone even while I'm doing that.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And then also, when Luke was passing away, when he was, under hospice care, he had a mission. Yeah. I don't know if he knew what it would become, but somebody had gifted him $10,000, a practical stranger, actually.
Really?
Who only met twice. Yes. I don't know if you want to hear the whole story, but
no, go ahead. That sounds wonderful.
So, our doctor, when Luke had his leg amputated, had another patient who was a man in his 50s who also had his leg amputated, I believe because of cancer. And somehow our doctor was talking to this man about Luke, and this man said, I'd really like to meet Luke and encourage him kind of in recovering with the amputation. And Luke, this was very early on in treatment. And Luke said, no, I don't want to meet this stranger,
Right.
who had his leg amputated. He didn't really necessarily want to meet other people in that situation at that time.
Right. Because he didn't even want to look at his own, and looking at somebody else would really remind him. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, and when Luke was going through radiation the second time in the fall of 2016, there was a man that we ran into a couple of times getting radiation in Grand Rapids. And I'm not sure how they started talking, but the man thought that might be Luke. He didn't know Luke's name, but and he and his wife introduced himself. When I met him the one time, I could see he was not in good shape, this man. They did say that, he was getting radiation for a relapse of his cancer. I don't know any other real details. But so one time when my husband was taking him, they talked, Luke and this man, and another time when I was there. And the man passed away by the end of that year. And his wife asked for our address, and the doctor called us. I said, sure, that's fine. And we got a very nice note from this woman that her husband wanted to give Luke $10,000 to just kind of make his life better as he was going, whatever he wanted or needed. Here's $10,000. And he had been inspired by Luke and Luke's kind of bravery and attitude just by meeting him twice and hearing about him through their doctor.
Wow.
And yeah, we were amazed. And at the time, Luke wanted to get a running blade for his leg and try to learn how to run. But as it turned out, the prosthetic doctor or the company that made this running blade ended up donating it to us as a gift.
Okay.
Without us asking.
Okay.
Right. So then he still had this $10,000. And he just he couldn't really travel. And, the doctors wouldn't allow us to do much traveling with he had the tumors in his lungs seemed to be the problem with traveling. And so he, again, it was just sitting there in a savings account. And as he was getting closer in that summer, he said, hey, can I give that $10,000 to friends and other students who say they can't go to Young Life Camp because they don't have the money? Because he said, I would ask my friends, I wanted them to go to Young Life Camp. I wanted them to hear the gospel. And a lot of times the money was why they couldn't go. Could we put that money towards it? And my husband said, oh, yeah, sure. That's great. And my husband's wheels started spinning on how to do this practically. And then he said to me at one time too, in those last few weeks, Mom, what's going to happen to the money you said was saved up for college? And I said, I don't know. And he said, can that go towards helping kids go to Young Life Camp? And I said, oh yeah, sure. We can do that. Yeah, that's great. So my husband started a fund that people could donate to. We call it the Luke Legacy Fund. And then we give out scholarships from it to help students go to Young Life camps.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So he knows all the numbers. I know we have like maybe $600,000 in there now.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. The donations we get, we've given out 300 or 400 scholarships over the last few years, although last year because of COVID,
Yeah, there weren't any. Yeah, probably.
Yeah. So, but, it's this way that Luke keeps giving, even though he's not here. And my ministry is connected to Luke too. I'm going to start a grief ministry at my church called Grief Share. And it's like I can keep giving because of Luke. But it's with, my gifts and talents that God has endowed me with. This is just the way I'm made. I'm a caregiver,
Yep. I relate 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a beautiful way to kind of keep Luke's memory alive. Both of those things, I think, to
Right.
be able to do those scholarships. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I just think, I'm sure Luke had no idea how big, he just thought we'd give all that money away and,
Yeah.
that many kids would have been able to go to camp. But my husband decided to make it this ongoing fund and ask for donations. And some people just are so touched by his story, they do want to give in that way. So, and to me, it's, I always say to God, please let Luke know when this student asked Jesus into his life, it was because of this scholarship of his. I hope you let Luke know that up in heaven, that there are people coming to know you, Lord, because of him. So,
yeah. Well, it's interesting because so Andy and Peter were both in the Grand Rapids Choir of Men and Boys. And when Andy died, we asked for all donations to just go there, to go there. And they did, and probably got, I think, $50,000 or $60,000 that year. And then we've continued to kind of support them and give them some money as well. But the boys do have to pay tuition. So the men that are in the choir don't, but the boys have to pay something. And it's not a lot of money, but it's a few $100s that you have to pay to be in it for the whole year. And then that's 4 concert series, that they have somewhere between 2 and 6 concerts in each of the 4. And it's a wonderful thing and beautiful experience. But obviously with COVID, everything got shut down, and it's been shut down for a long time. And actually the very first thing that was canceled was the Andy Larson Memorial Concert that was supposed to be done, that we had, a choir coming from England, Andy's favorite choir from England coming. And we had all the tickets sold within weeks, and that was canceled. That was the very first thing canceled. And the choir has not met yet. They're going to be starting up again this coming fall. But when they talked about coming back, they were able to say, because of, first of all, some of my other doctors in my group decided to make an Andy Larson scholarship fund to pay for some of the kids if they didn't have the money to be able to pay for them to be in the choir. And so there is the Andy Larson Scholarship Fund that is in existence. And I don't know how much money is in there, and that will help pay some tuitions. But the even kind of cooler thing this year is coming up this fall. They have brought in so much money through our family and through Andy that they're not charging any boy tuition the entire year.
yeah.
So it's a beautiful thing, a beautiful gift to be able to give. And, it's very sad because obviously Peter didn't have his last concerts, and now he's really growing and his voice is finally kind of changing, which Andy's never did. But, so he's not going to be able to do it again. We had probably 75-80% of the music recorded for a commemorative CD of Andy, and Peter was supposed to sing a solo in that, which now he won't be able to do. And anyway, there was a lot of loss, but there's a lot of blessing too, that we will be able to, continue to bless this choir. Yes. And they feel so fortunate that they're financially in a good spot, which they wouldn't have been otherwise, right? That we were able to give them enough donation that they feel like they're on good footing when things do start up again. So
right.
Yeah. So it's a blessing. It's a blessing.
Yeah. And we, as moms, selfishly would trade that.
Yeah.
For having our kids back. People tell me, you're so strong in your faith. And I think, I don't know if I am or not, but I would trade all these blessings still to have them back
for sure.
in my life.
Yeah, for sure. But Andy loves singing that sacred music, that church music. I mean, he loved that. So I'm glad that we will be able to, again, bless the Grand Rapids community with that. 'Cause I think there are only about 6 men and boys choirs in existence in this country. Most of them are in Europe. So it's a blessing that we have.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, well, I have just feel like my last interviews here have been lots of tears. I don't know if it's the anniversary date coming up or what it is, but thank
Yeah.
you so much for sharing, Luke.
You're welcome.
I loved hearing about him. I loved hearing about his faith.
Thank you.
Anyway, it's a real blessing to be able to talk to you.
Thank you. Well, it's a blessing to talk to you too. And I hope I get to meet you in person.
I know we don't live that far away. We will have to arrange it at some point in time.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Losing a Child, Always Andy's Mom. Please subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player. We are always looking for new show ideas. If you'd like to be a guest, know someone who'd be a great guest, or have a show idea, please email us at marcy@andysmom.com. Be sure to visit the webpage, andysmom.com, for more content, including Marcy's blog. There you can also sign up to receive updates via email. Together, let's work to inspire hope, one day at a time.